In a small town where dreams are crushed by prejudice and poverty, a young girl named Amara has one goal: to rescue a puppy she loves more than anything. She's poor, she's determined, and all she wants is a puppy. But when the town turns against her, the kindness that follows will leave you speechless. This is a story you won't forget. Before we get into this unforgettable story, make sure you're subscribed to Epic Story Moments. Don't forget to hit that bell so you never miss another amazing tale. If you enjoy the story, like, share, and leave a comment. It helps us bring more heartwarming stories your way. And we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Let's stay connected. Amara, a 12-year-old girl with a gentle spirit and a big heart, lived in a small rural town in the southern United States. The town, though picturesque in some areas, was divided by deep cultural and economic disparities. On one side were the pristine, manicured estates of wealthy families who enjoyed a life of privilege. On the other were the modest, aging homes of hard-working families like Amara's, struggling to make ends meet. Amara lived with her single mother, Miss Clarice, a housekeeper who toiled long hours cleaning the homes of the wealthier townsfolk. Despite her exhaustion, Miss Clarice always made time for her daughter, filling their small, humble home with stories of strength, hope, and perseverance. Their bond was strong, and their love for each other shone even in the face of hardship. Every day, Amara witnessed her mother's sacrifices, and she quietly resolved to one day make life easier for both of them. Amara's best friend, Janelle, was her greatest confidant. The two girls shared everything, from their worries about school to their dreams of escaping their little town for a brighter future. Janelle understood Amara in a way no one else could, but even she couldn't fully grasp the depth of one of Amara's most cherished dreams, to have a puppy of her own. On her way home from school each day, Amara would take a detour to pass by the local pet shop owned by Mr. Winston, an older man with a gruff demeanor and a reputation for being tough. The shop was a small, weathered building with a wooden sign that creaked in the wind. Inside, the smell of sawdust and hay mixed with the sound of barking puppies. Though Mr. Winston rarely cracked a smile, he ran the only pet shop in town, and his animals were well cared for. Amara would stand outside, her breath fogging the glass, as she gazed longingly at the puppies playing inside. Among them, one scruffy little mutt with mismatched ears caught her eye. He wasn't the biggest or the most energetic of the bunch, but there was something about his playful yet gentle nature that tugged at her heart. She secretly named him Lucky. To Amara, Lucky represented more than just a pet. He was a beacon of hope in her often challenging world, a symbol of the life she dreamed of, one filled with warmth, companionship, and joy. She imagined the two of them walking together through the town park, or cuddling on the couch at home. In her heart, Lucky was already hers, but in reality, she knew that owning a puppy was far beyond their reach. Puppies weren't cheap, and with her mother struggling to pay the bills, there was no room for such luxuries. Still, Amara couldn't help but dream. Each time she passed the shop, she would pause and silently promise herself that one day she would find a way to bring Lucky home. She imagined saving her pennies, working odd jobs, and somehow convincing Mr. Winston to let her have him. She clung to that dream, even when the practical side of her reminded her how unlikely it was. Dreams, after all, were free, and dreaming gave her hope. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Amara lingered outside the pet shop longer than usual. Inside, Lucky was playing with a worn-out chew toy, his tail wagging happily. Amara pressed her hands and face against the glass, a bittersweet smile on her face. Lucky seemed to notice her and trotted over, his nose sniffing curiously at the other side of the glass. For a brief moment, it felt as though the puppy understood her longing. "Someday," Amara whispered, her voice barely audible over the evening breeze. "One day, you'll be mine." As she walked home, the glow of the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement, Amara held on tightly to her dream. She didn't know how or when, but she believed with all her heart that one day She and Lucky would be together. That hope was enough to carry her through the challenges of her everyday life, and it fueled her determination to keep moving forward, no matter what obstacles lay ahead. Amara's life was defined by an unspoken struggle, a constant balancing act between what she desired and what her family could afford. The harsh truth of her situation hit her the hardest in the moments when she allowed herself to dream. As much as she longed for the companionship of a puppy, her mother, Miss Clarice, was fighting battles of her own. She worked long hours as a housekeeper, cleaning the homes of the wealthy families in town. But the pay was meager, and bills piled up relentlessly. There was never enough left over for luxuries, and a puppy was definitely a luxury. Every month, Amara watched her mother stretch every dollar, cutting back on anything unnecessary. The utility bills, the rent, the food, it all had to be prioritized. Miss Clarice would sit at the kitchen table late at night, paying what she could with a tired sigh, always looking for ways to stretch the little they had. Amara knew better than to ask for things she didn't need. She had learned early that their family's survival depended on sacrifices. Yet, despite the challenges, there was a constant reminder of the disparities between her family and the town's wealthier residents. The Thatchers, a prominent family in town, were a constant presence in Amara's life. They lived in the largest estate in the area, a sprawling mansion surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens. Mrs. Thatcher, the matriarch, was known for her influence, her elegance, and her sharp tongue. She carried herself like someone who was born into a world of privilege, and she made no secret of her disdain for families like Amara's. One afternoon, as Amara and her mother walked past the grand Thatcher estate, they overheard a conversation that made Amara's heart tighten in her chest. Mrs. Thatcher was speaking to a neighbor, her voice dripping with disdain. "People like her," she said, referring to Amara's family, "don't belong in places like this." The word stung. Amara wanted to turn around and confront Mrs. Thatcher, but her mother, sensing her discomfort, gently took her hand and led her away. But the hurt lingered. Amara didn't understand why Mrs. Thatcher, or anyone in town, would see her family as less than others. She knew they were poor, but that didn't mean they didn't have value. Her mother had worked hard her whole life, and Amara, too, worked tirelessly to help. It wasn't fair to be judged for things beyond their control. The comment burned in Amara's mind, and the more she thought about it, the more determined she became to prove her worth, not just to Mrs. Thatcher, but to herself and everyone who thought they were unimportant. Despite the sting of that harsh judgment, Amara's heart remained full of kindness. It was this kindness that led her to another pivotal moment. One evening, as she was walking home from school, she noticed her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Green, struggling to repair a broken fence in her garden. Mrs. Green's hands shook with age, and the task was too much for her to manage alone. Without hesitation, Amara offered to help. Despite her own busy schedule and the long hours she spent assisting her mother, she gathered the necessary tools, knelt down beside Mrs. Green, and worked together to fix the fence. Mrs. Green's face lit up with gratitude, and Amara felt a quiet joy in helping someone who appreciated the small things in life. This act of kindness, simple but profound, became a recurring theme in Amara's life. She realized that even in the midst of struggles, there was always an opportunity to help others. Her actions were not just about giving. They were about showing the world that kindness, no matter how small, could create ripples of goodness. As Amara's life unfolded, a strange connection began to form between her and Lucky, the puppy she dreamed of bringing home. One evening, as she wandered through the park near Mr. Winston's pet shop, Amara was startled by the sight of Lucky running free. Somehow, the little dog had escaped from the shop and was darting playfully through the grass. Without thinking, Amara ran toward him, her heart racing with excitement. The two of them tumbled together in the grass, laughing and playing as if they had known each other for years. For a brief, shining moment, it felt as though Lucky was hers. He nuzzled against her, and Amara stroked his scruffy fur, her heart full of a joy she had not known in a long time. But soon, reality set in. She knew she couldn't keep him. She reluctantly scooped him up and made her way back to the pet shop, where Mr. Winston was waiting. The moment she entered the shop, Mr. Winston's face hardened. "What are you doing with that dog?" he growled, though his voice lacked the usual sharpness. Amara felt a pang of guilt, but stood her ground. "I found him in the park," she explained quietly. "He escaped." Mr. Winston gave her a long, hard look before nodding and taking Lucky from her arms. "You shouldn't be messing around with dogs like that," he said, his voice still stern. "You don't have the means to care for him." Amara's heart sank, but she didn't argue. She simply nodded and left the shop, her steps heavy. Yet, as she walked away, Mr. Winston's voice called out to her. "Listen," he said, softer now. "I see the way you look at him. You care for that dog, and I can see it. Just don't get any ideas. You're not ready for something like that." Amara didn't know what to make of his words, but deep inside, she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't let go of Lucky. He had become a symbol of hope, of a better life she was determined to build, and nothing was going to stop her from chasing that dream. Amara's determination grew stronger with each passing day. She couldn't ignore the dream she had for Lucky, the one that filled her heart with warmth every time she thought of the little dog. He represented more than just a puppy. He was a symbol of hope, of a better life, a life where she wasn't bound by the limitations of her family's financial struggles. The thought of losing him forever drove her to action. With a resolve she hadn't known she had, Amara began taking on odd jobs around town. She didn't care how tiring or tedious the work was. She was willing to do whatever it took to save enough money for Lucky. She washed cars at the local gas station, babysat the children of wealthy families, and ran errands for neighbors who needed help. Every dollar she earned went straight into a small jar hidden under her bed, and every night she added her earnings, counting them with growing excitement. At first, the adults in town were skeptical of Amara's ambitions. They didn't understand why she was working so hard, and many doubted she would ever reach her goal. Some even assumed she was wasting her time, but Amara didn't let their doubts shake her. She worked harder, faster, and longer. She had never been one to back down from a challenge, and this was no different. However, her efforts were soon met with a series of obstacles. The first blow came when Mrs. Thatcher, the same woman who had insulted Amara's family not long ago, sabotaged one of Amara's jobs. Amara had been hired to clean the windows of the Thatcher estate, a task she had taken on eagerly, hoping to earn a few extra dollars. She worked tirelessly, scrubbing each pane with care, but when she finished, Mrs. Thatcher refused to pay her. "That's not what I agreed to," Mrs. Thatcher said coldly, her eyes narrowing. "You missed spots. You'll have to do it again." Amara knew she had done the job well, but it didn't matter. Mrs. Thatcher's word was law, and Amara had no choice but to leave empty-handed. She felt the sting of injustice, but the moment of defeat was brief. She refused to let it break her spirit. There were other jobs to take, other chances to earn money, and she would take them all. Still, the town's subtle prejudice was hard to ignore. Amara could feel the weight of the look she received as she went about her work. Some people would avoid her gaze or whisper behind her back, their eyes full of judgment. It was as if they saw her as nothing more than a girl from the wrong side of town, someone who didn't belong in their world. It was a daily reminder of the divide that existed in the town, a divide Amara could never cross, no matter how hard she tried. The emotional weight of it all began to take its toll on Amara. One afternoon, after a long day of working, she sat on the porch with Janelle, the only person who seemed to understand her. Her best friend had always been there for her, offering encouragement when the world seemed too heavy. But even Janelle couldn't shield her from the doubts that had begun to creep into her mind. "What if I'm not enough?" Amara asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What if I work and still never get what I want? What if no one will ever see me for who I really am?" Janelle looked at her with soft eyes, but Amara could tell she didn't have the answer. There were no words that could make her feel better. The truth was, Amara felt like the world was stacked against her. She was a poor black girl in a town that saw her as less than everyone else. How could she possibly overcome all that? How could she prove to herself and the world that she deserved more? But despite the heaviness in her heart, Amara refused to give up. She couldn't afford to, not with Lucky's fate hanging in the balance. That very night, as Amara lay in bed, staring at the jar of coins she had so carefully accumulated, she overheard a conversation that would change everything. As she passed by Mr. Winston's pet shop, she overheard him speaking with another man, a well-dressed customer. The man was asking about Lucky, expressing interest in buying the puppy. Mr. Winston hesitated, but the buyer was persistent. "I'll pay top dollar for him," the man said, his voice oozing with entitlement. "I want that dog for my daughter. It's a gift for her birthday." Amara's heart sank as she heard the exchange. Lucky, the little dog she had dreamed of bringing home, was about to be sold to someone else. Someone who could afford him, someone who didn't have to work for months just to buy him. The thought of losing him forever was unbearable. Her mind raced, and a new sense of urgency filled her. She had to act quickly, before it was too late. There was no time to waste. With the money she had saved up, Amara knew she had just enough to buy Lucky, but she needed to find a way to do it before he was sold to the rich buyer. She wasn't sure how she would make it happen, but she knew she had to try. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Lucky's bark in the distance, a familiar sound that reminded her of the bond they shared. She clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. She would do whatever it took to make sure Lucky wasn't taken from her. She would find a way. As the days passed, Amara's resolve grew ever stronger, but so did the mounting challenges that threatened to shatter her dream. No matter how hard she worked, washing cars, babysitting, running errands, the money just didn't add up fast enough. The coins in her jar were counted and recounted, but they never seemed to get her closer to her goal. Amara knew she needed a few $100 more to be able to buy Lucky, and each passing day brought her closer to losing him to the wealthy buyer. She could feel the weight of time pressing down on her, the pressure building with each new obstacle she faced. The work was grueling, and the little money she earned seemed like a drop in the ocean. Desperation crept into her thoughts, and doubts began to cloud her mind. Could she really pull this off? Was it even worth trying anymore? Then came the rumors. Mrs. Thatcher, ever the voice of influence in the town, had begun to spread word that Amara was nothing but trouble. Her accusations were subtle at first. Whispers behind closed doors, words that Amara couldn't always hear, but could certainly feel. Mrs. Thatcher called her troublesome and warned others not to trust her. Amara had no idea why Mrs. Thatcher was so determined to make her life harder, but she knew it was part of a larger pattern, the pattern of prejudice and judgment that seemed to follow her wherever she went. The rumors took root, and soon people in the town began to hesitate when it came to offering her work. One by one, the jobs that had once been easy to come by were slipping through her fingers. A woman canceled a cleaning job at the last minute. A man told her his yard had already been taken care of. It wasn't just a matter of bad luck. It was clear that Mrs. Thatcher's influence had spread further than Amara could have imagined. The isolation grew, and Amara found herself fighting not only for Lucky, but for her own place in the world. In the quiet moments when Amara was alone, the weight of it all began to crush her spirit. She had worked so hard, sacrificed so much, yet it felt like the universe was conspiring against her. She wondered if the dream of owning Lucky was just a fantasy, a naive wish from a girl who didn't understand how things really worked. Was it even worth the fight anymore? One evening, as Amara sat at the kitchen table, her mother, Miss Clarice, joined her. The lines on her face were deeper than ever, and the fatigue in her eyes was unmistakable. Amara had been watching her mother struggle for years, but lately, it seemed like the burden of their lives was starting to wear her down. Miss Clarice had always been her rock, but in that moment, she seemed unsure. "Amara," she began softly, her voice laced with worry. "I think it's time you let go of this idea of getting a puppy. It's too much. We can't afford it. And you've been working so hard, but you're not getting anywhere. Amara's heart twisted in her chest. The last thing she ever wanted was to disappoint her mother. But hearing those words from Miss Clarice made her feel like she was giving up on something she had held so dearly for so long. She had put everything into this dream, and now her own mother was telling her to stop. "But Mom," Amara's voice cracked. "I can't just give up. I've been working so hard. Lucky's he's everything to me. He's a chance to make things better. Don't you see? This is more than just a dog. It's a way out." Miss Clarice's expression softened, but the concern in her eyes remained. "I know, baby, but sometimes we have to let go of things we can't have. I don't want to see you hurt any more than you already are." The conversation left Amara feeling hollow. She knew her mother was right, but she couldn't bring herself to let go of the dream. She couldn't bear the thought of giving up on something that had given her hope in such a difficult life. As the night drew on, Amara stared at the jar of coins under her bed, feeling the weight of her unspoken fears. But even as her doubts lingered, Amara's resilience began to shine through in ways she hadn't expected. One afternoon, as she walked through the neighborhood, feeling defeated and uncertain, she encountered an unexpected ally. Mrs. Green, the elderly woman whose fence Amara had helped fix earlier in the year, called out to her from her porch. "Amara, come here, child," she said, her voice raspy but warm. Amara approached hesitantly, unsure of what to expect, but Mrs. Green's presence was always comforting. The old woman smiled at her, her wrinkled face softening in a knowing way. "I've been watching you, girl," Mrs. Green said, her eyes twinkling with a quiet wisdom. "You've been working so hard, and I know it's not easy. I can see it in your eyes, that fire in you. Don't let it burn out. You've got a good heart, Amara. You're doing the right thing." Amara felt a lump form in her throat, the sincerity in Mrs. Green's words wrapping around her like a warm blanket. For the first time in weeks, she felt understood. Mrs. Green, with her years of experience, had seen the struggles Amara was going through, and instead of discouraging her, the old woman encouraged her to keep going. "I know things seem tough," Mrs. Green continued, "but don't you ever forget that you're stronger than you think. And when the world tells you no, sometimes you've got to fight back even harder." Amara smiled through the tears that welled up in her eyes. Mrs. Green's support, her belief in Amara, gave her the strength to keep pushing forward. She wasn't alone. She had people who believed in her, even when the world seemed to be against her. With renewed determination, Amara wiped away her tears and thanked Mrs. Green. As she walked away, she made a silent promise to herself. She wasn't going to give up on Lucky. No matter what it took, she would find a way to make her dream come true. The road ahead was still full of obstacles, but now she had a glimmer of hope that made her believe she could face whatever came next. The days passed, and as Amara worked tirelessly toward her goal, something began to change, both in the town and within herself. The pressure of the struggle hadn't broken her spirit, and now, in the midst of her hard work, there were small signs of progress, unexpected moments that reminded her she wasn't alone. One such moment came from Mr. Winston, the gruff old man who owned a local pet shop. At first, Amara had seen him as just another obstacle, a hardened figure who never showed any kindness to anyone, let alone a girl like her. He would often scold her for getting too close to the puppies, his sharp voice cutting through the air whenever she'd lingered too long, gazing longingly at the dogs. But lately, something had shifted. Mr. Winston had begun to notice Amara's dedication. Not only her work ethic, but also the care she showed to the animals, particularly Lucky. One afternoon, after Amara had finished another job and was passing by the pet shop, Mr. Winston waved her inside. "You've been working your fingers to the bone, girl," he grunted, eyeing her as she stepped into the dusty store. "Come here. I need to talk to you." Amara walked cautiously toward him, unsure of what to expect. To her surprise, he wasn't angry, nor was he gruff. His face had softened, his sharp edges dulled by something that seemed like compassion. "I've been watching you," he said, his voice lower than usual. "You're persistent, A lot of people around here wouldn't work as hard as you do for a dog. I've seen that you care about that mutt. Lucky. Amara's heart fluttered with a mix of excitement and nervousness. It wasn't often that anyone, let alone Mr. Winston, acknowledged her in this way. She stepped closer, and for a moment, he just stood there, looking at her with an unreadable expression. Look, he continued finally with a sigh, I've been in your shoes. Not with dogs, but with life. When I was younger, I had nothing. I worked every day, every hour, just to scrape by. My family never had the money to keep the business going. And people looked down on me too. But I built this shop from the ground up. Took me years to make it what it is now. It wasn't easy, and sometimes it still isn't. Amara listened intently, absorbing his words. She had never imagined that Mr. Winston had a past like hers, filled with struggle and sacrifice. It made her feel less alone, knowing that someone like him had faced obstacles and found a way to overcome them. Maybe you'll get there too one day, Mr. Winston added, his tone softening further. Just don't give up. You've got something people don't expect, girl grit. Amara smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had always seen Mr. Winston as a barrier, someone who didn't care about her dreams. But in this moment, she realized he had been watching all along, seeing her struggle and determination. His words meant more to her than she could express, and she left the pet shop with a renewed sense of purpose. As the days wore on, Amara's bond with Lucky continued to grow. She visited the pet shop more frequently, each time feeling the pull between the life she was working so hard to build and the one she wanted to have with Lucky. Every time she walked through the door, Lucky seemed to recognize her immediately, his small tail wagging furiously as he bounded toward her. One afternoon, as Amara reached out to pet him, something magical happened. Lucky jumped up and leaped into her arms. His tiny body nestled against her chest as if he had been waiting for this moment. Amara laughed softly, the tears welling up in her eyes. It was as if the puppy had known all along. She was the one who would take him home, the one who cared for him when no one else had. In that moment, the bond between them deepened, and Amara felt the weight of the world lift off her shoulders. Despite the odds stacked against her, despite the struggles and the prejudice she faced every day, this small moment of connection made it all feel worth it. She would never give up on Lucky, but as Amara's journey continued, the tension in the town only grew more palpable. The divide between the wealthy and the working class seemed to grow wider, fueled by the actions of people like Mrs. Thatcher. One day, while Amara was walking through the town square, Mrs. Thatcher stood with a group of women, her voice loud and cutting. I don't know why people like her think they're entitled to anything, Mrs. Thatcher sneered, her eyes scanning Amara from head to toe. A puppy of all things? Just because she works a few odd jobs doesn't mean she deserves it. People like her belong in the background, not in the same spaces as us. Amara froze, the words hitting her like a slap in the face. It wasn't the first time Mrs. Thatcher had spoken poorly of her, but something about hearing those words in front of so many people felt different. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment, she felt small, insignificant, as if the weight of the town's prejudice was suffocating her. But as Mrs. Thatcher turned to walk away, something unexpected happened. A few townsfolk who had been standing nearby exchanged glances and then spoke up. That's not right, one man said, shaking his head. Amara's a hard worker. She's been nothing but kind to this town. Another woman nodded in agreement. I don't know her well, but I've seen her around. She's always helping others, always doing what she can. No one deserves to be treated like that. For the first time, Amara felt the community starting to shift. The whispers, the judgments, the prejudice that had always followed her began to crack. She wasn't alone in this fight. There were people who saw her for who she truly was, people who respected her determination and heart. The words from the townsfolk didn't erase the damage Mrs. Thatcher had caused, but they were a small victory, a glimmer of hope in the midst of everything. As Amara continued on her journey, the social divide in the town seemed to weaken just a little. She wasn't just fighting for Lucky anymore. She was fighting for a future where she and others like her could stand tall, unashamed and unapologetically themselves. As Amara continued to grow closer to her goal, her confidence began to build. She worked even harder, her determination sharper than ever. She had saved up a considerable sum of money from her odd jobs, and her bond with Lucky was stronger than ever. It seemed like nothing could stop her now. But just as things were starting to fall into place, disaster struck. One afternoon, Amara went to the pet shop as usual, eager to check on Lucky. But as soon as she walked in, she could tell something was wrong. Mr. Winston's usually gruff face was etched with worry. His brow was furrowed, and he wasn't his usual self. "Amara," he began, his voice unusually quiet. "We need to talk." Her heart sank. The last time he spoke to her like that, it was about Lucky being sold to someone else. She had feared this moment for so long. With a lump in her throat, she took a deep breath and prepared herself for the worst. "Lucky's not doing well," Mr. Winston continued, his voice cracking slightly. "He's sick, and I can't afford the treatment. The vet says it's serious, and unless we get him some proper care, he might not make it. I'm sorry, Amara, but I might have to let him go to someone who can afford the medical expenses." Amara's world seemed to collapse in that instant. Her heart shattered into a million pieces as the reality of the situation set in. She had worked so hard, faced so many obstacles, and now it seemed like she was about to lose everything. She couldn't lose Lucky, not after everything they had been through. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she fought them back, determined not to break in front of Mr. Winston. Instead, she stood up straighter, her resolve firm. "No," Amara whispered, shaking her head. "I won't let that happen. I'll figure out a way. I'll raise the money." Mr. Winston looked at her with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. He had seen a lot of things in his life, but he had never seen a child as determined as Amara. "You really think you can do that?" he asked, his voice full of doubt. "I have to," Amara replied, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I'll organize a fundraiser. I'll get the money. Please, Mr. Winston, I won't let Lucky go." With that, Amara left the pet shop, her mind racing with ideas. She had no experience organizing fundraisers, but she knew she couldn't afford to waste any time. She began reaching out to people in the community, explaining the situation and asking for help. She even went door to door, asking for donations. It wasn't easy. Many people were skeptical, and some outright refused to help. But Amara's determination was contagious, and slowly, people started to rally behind her. One by one, the townsfolk began to show up at her makeshift fundraiser. They donated money, supplies, and even time. Mrs. Green, who had always supported Amara, volunteered to bake goods for a bake sale. Mr. Winston, though still uncertain, offered his support, providing a location for the event in the pet shop. Even some of the people who had been indifferent or skeptical about Amara's efforts in the past began to chip in, realizing that she was not just a girl chasing a dream, but someone who truly cared and had the heart to fight for it. As the fundraiser progressed, Amara began to feel hopeful. It wasn't going to be easy, but she was making progress. She saw the change in people's hearts, how they were willing to help someone who had been written off by so many. The idea of community, of people coming together to help one of their own, filled Amara with a sense of purpose. This was her moment, the moment she had been working toward. But just as she was beginning to believe that the tide was turning in her favor, something unexpected happened. The donations were pouring in, and Amara was starting to feel the weight of hope lifting off her shoulders. But as she was tallying the contributions late one evening, something caught her eye, a large envelope addressed to her. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but it was neatly written, and the paper was thick, expensive. It was from someone in the town. Curious, Amara opened the envelope. Inside, she found a check made out for more than enough to cover Lucky's medical bills, and then some. The note accompanying the check was simple. Asterisk, I believe in you, Amara. You deserve to have your dream. E. asterisk, Amara stared at the letter in shock. The handwriting was familiar, but she couldn't place it. She knew of only one person whose name began with an E. Elliot Thatcher, Mrs. Thatcher's son. Her heart raced as she thought back to the way he had looked at her the few times they had crossed paths. Quiet, reserved, but always kind. She had never imagined that Elliot, someone from the wealthier side of town, would do something like this. Mrs. Thatcher had always been cruel to Amara and her family, and Amara had assumed her son shared those same prejudices. But this was different. This act of kindness didn't just speak to the generosity of a wealthy person. It spoke to something much deeper. Elliot had seen something in Amara that his mother had never been able to see. The strength, the heart, and the resilience that refused to be crushed under the weight of the world's expectations. The realization left Amara stunned. A wealthy person, a Thatcher, had chosen to quietly support her, to show her that her dreams were not as impossible as they seemed. In that moment, Amara knew that no matter the obstacles in her path, she was not alone. The check would save Lucky. But more importantly, it symbolized something larger. The breaking down of barriers, the beginning of a shift in how the community saw her. And with that, Amara's resolve grew even stronger. She was going to make sure Lucky had the life he deserved, and she was going to prove to everyone, including herself, that dreams could come true no matter where you came from. The fundraiser had exceeded Amara's wildest expectations. What had started as a desperate attempt to save Lucky had blossomed into a full-fledged community event. Donations flooded in from all corners of the town, some small, some large, but each one adding to the collective effort that was beginning to take shape. The bake sale with Mrs. Green's homemade pies and cakes had been a hit. A local musician offered to perform for free, drawing more people in. Even the local diner chipped in, providing free food for the volunteers working tirelessly to make the event a success. And then there was Elliot's anonymous donation. The large check had arrived like a beacon of hope, a silent gesture that spoke volumes more than words could. Amara had no idea why Elliot had chosen to help, but she was grateful. His quiet kindness seemed to ripple through the community, sparking a sense of unity that Amara had never imagined possible in a town so divided. With each passing hour, it seemed that more people were seeing her not just as a poor girl with a dream, but as someone worthy of support, someone who could make a difference. As the final tally came in, Amara couldn't believe her eyes. The amount raised was more than enough to cover Lucky's medical expenses, and there was even money left over for his adoption fee. It was a triumph, a testament to the power of determination and community spirit. Amara's heart swelled with pride and relief, knowing that Lucky would soon be safe. But just as things seemed to be falling into place, an unexpected confrontation occurred that threatened to shatter everything Amara had worked for. It happened on the day Amara was supposed to collect the final donation from Mr. Winston. She was at the pet shop, practically bursting with excitement, when Mrs. Thatcher appeared. The wealthy matriarch of the town had been watching the fundraiser from afar, and now she was stepping in, her presence as imposing as ever. "Amara," Mrs. Thatcher sneered, her voice dripping with condescension. "I've heard about your little fundraiser. You're exploiting people's pity to get what you want, aren't you? It's pathetic." Amara froze, her joy faltering under the weight of Mrs. Thatcher's words. She had expected to face resistance, but this was something different. Mrs. Thatcher wasn't just criticizing Amara for her actions. She was attacking her character, trying to paint her as manipulative and undeserving. The insult stung, but Amara wasn't about to back down. For a moment, she felt small, like she might crumble under the force of the woman's scorn. But then, something inside her clicked. She had come this far, against all odds, and she wasn't about to let Mrs. Thatcher's cruel words undo everything. Amara straightened her back, looked Mrs. Thatcher in the eye, and spoke with a calm confidence that surprised even her. "You don't understand," Amara said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "This isn't about pity. It's about people coming together. It's about kindness and believing in something bigger than ourselves. I've worked hard for this. I've done everything I can to make sure Lucky has a chance. This town has shown me more kindness than I could have ever imagined, and I'm not going to let anyone tell me that I don't deserve that." Mrs. Thatcher's expression darkened, but Amara didn't flinch. She had spent so much of her life listening to people like Mrs. Thatcher, people who saw her as less than, people who doubted her worth. But now, she wasn't listening. She wasn't going to let those voices drown out the truth, that she had worked for this, fought for this, and had earned the chance to have something she loved. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" Mrs. Thatcher spat, her face twisting in anger. "But you're nothing. You'll always be nothing." Amara's heart pounded, but she held her ground. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've been through. But I do know this. Kindness matters. It's more important than money, more important than status. And I'm not going to let anyone make me feel like I'm not worthy of that." For a long moment, there was silence between them. Mrs. Thatcher's eyes narrowed, and Amara could see the contempt in her gaze. But Amara didn't flinch. She had said what she needed to say. The words had come from the heart, and they had nothing left to prove. Just as the tension reached its peak, a surprising voice interrupted the standoff. "You're wrong, Mrs. Thatcher," Mr. Winston said from the doorway, his rough voice cutting through the air. The old man had been listening quietly from the back of the shop, and now his usual gruffness was replaced with something more resolute. "Amara's not exploiting anyone. She's fighting for what she believes in, and that's something I can respect." Mrs. Thatcher turned to him, her face incredulous. "What are you talking about? You, of all people, are defending this child?" Mr. Winston stepped forward, his eyes softening as he looked at Amara. "I've watched her. I've seen how hard she's worked, how much she cares. She's earned the right to have Lucky, and I'm not going to stand by and let anyone take that from her." He paused, then added, "And if she can raise enough for the adoption fee, I'll cover the rest of his medical expenses." "I'm in her corner." Amara's breath caught in her throat, a wave of gratitude and disbelief washing over her. She had never expected Mr. Winston, the gruff, stoic man who had seemed so distant, to be the one to stand by her. But here he was, offering not just his support, but his resources, to help her make her dream a reality. Mrs. Thatcher sputtered in disbelief, her face flushed with anger. But Amara didn't pay her any mind. The support from Mr. Winston and from the community was all she needed to feel that her efforts had not been in vain. In that moment, Amara knew that the fight wasn't just about saving Lucky. It was about proving to herself and to everyone who had ever doubted her that she was worthy of kindness, worthy of love, and worthy of her dreams. The weight of that realization lifted her spirit, and she walked out of the pet shop with a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was still long, but with allies like Mr. Winston, Mrs. Green, and the people of the town behind her, she knew that anything was possible. Amara poured every ounce of energy she had into the fundraiser. What had started as a modest plan was now a full-scale effort, and she wasn't going to let anything stand in her way. She spent late nights crafting handmade posters, her hands shaking slightly as she sketched pictures of puppies, including one of Lucky, the very dog that had captured her heart. The posters were simple but heartfelt, each one an invitation for the town to come together for a cause that meant more to Amara than anything else. Janelle, always by her side, helped her distribute the posters around town. Together, they hung them on streetlights, on shop windows, even on the doors of the town's church. They spoke to anyone who would listen, explaining Amara's mission and her determination to save Lucky. Janelle's support was invaluable. Her infectious enthusiasm was a counterbalance to Amara's moments of doubt. Janelle had always been there for Amara, and now, more than ever, she was her rock. But despite their hard work, progress was slow. Donations trickled in slowly, and Amara could see the concern in Janelle's eyes. The townsfolk were willing to help, but it wasn't enough. Amara had worked out a budget, calculated the costs, and even anticipated a few setbacks. But as the deadline drew closer, it was clear her savings weren't nearly enough. To make up the difference, Amara threw herself into even more odd jobs. She ran errands for people, helped Mr. Winston with tasks at the pet shop, and offered to do chores for neighbors for free if it meant earning their goodwill. Her determination to make this fundraiser a success had become a driving force not just for her, but for those around her. Still, the pressure was mounting. Amara found herself awake late into the night, staring at the ledger where she kept track of the funds. The numbers didn't add up. Despite all her efforts, it seemed that the amount she had raised would fall woefully short. The sinking feeling in her chest was becoming unbearable, and she could feel the crushing weight of her fear. What if it wasn't enough? What if, after all her sacrifices, she lost Lucky forever? On the morning of the final day, Amara sat on the steps of her small home, a quiet despair settling over her. She had come so far, but now it seemed like the end. She had done everything she could, but it wasn't enough. Lucky was slipping away, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She could barely bring herself to face Mr. Winston, who had become something of an ally in her quest to save the puppy. Maybe this was all just a dream, she murmured to herself, her voice barely audible. Maybe it was never meant to be. But just as she was about to lose hope, a soft voice broke through the fog of her thoughts. "Hey, Amara." Janelle's voice was steady, her hand resting gently on Amara's shoulder. "You've done everything you can. You've worked harder than anyone I know. And no matter what happens, you're already a winner in my book." Amara looked up at her friend, and for the first time in days, a small spark of hope flickered within her. Janelle was right. She had done everything she could. She had fought, she had worked, and she had inspired others to help. That was something no one could take away from her. "I don't know if I can do it," Amara confessed, the weight of uncertainty still heavy in her voice. "But I don't want to give up. I can't give up on Lucky." Janelle smiled, a grin that reached her eyes and lit up her whole face. "Then we won't. We're in this together, right?" Amara nodded, feeling a surge of determination wash over her. She couldn't stop now. No matter what the outcome, she had to try until the very last moment. But as the final hours of the fundraiser ticked away, Amara's fear started to crystallize once more. With just minutes left before the cutoff time, she looked at the total amount raised, and it was nowhere near enough. She had barely enough to cover the medical bills, let alone the adoption fee. She felt her heart sinking. It was then that something unexpected happened. As she stood in front of the pet shop, trying to figure out how to break the news to Mr. Winston, a familiar figure appeared in the distance. It was Mrs. Green, the elderly neighbor who had always been kind to Amara. She was holding something in her hands, a small, handwritten note. When she reached Amara, she handed it over. "Here," Mrs. Green said, her voice soft but filled with purpose. "This is for Lucky. I believe in you, child." Amara blinked, looking down at the note. It wasn't a check or cash. Instead, Mrs. Green had written a heartfelt letter, pledging her support in any way she could. It wasn't much, but it was more than a donation. It was a gesture that said, "I believe in you." Tears welled in Amara's eyes, but she held them back. She had come so far, and now she had the support of people who truly cared. The realization hit her like a wave. This wasn't just about the money. It was about the community coming together, about the kindness that could bloom even in the harshest of circumstances. But the clock was still ticking, and Amara was running out of time. With just minutes left, she took a deep breath and looked up at the sky, willing herself to keep going. She had come this far, and she couldn't stop now. Determined, she made a final push to reach out to the last few people she hadn't yet contacted. As she sent a last-ditch appeal to the town's online forum, she crossed her fingers. It was a long shot, but she had to try. Then, as the final moments approached, something unexpected happened. She received an email, and when she opened it, her heart skipped a beat. It was from Elliot, the same boy who had anonymously donated earlier. This time, his name was attached to the donation, and his message was clear. For Lucky, for Amara, for hope. In that moment, Amara realized that sometimes it's not just about what you can do on your own. Sometimes it's about the unexpected kindness of others, the generosity that comes from places you least expect, and the belief that together we can make the impossible happen. As the final seconds of the fundraiser ticked away, Amara knew she had done everything she could, and in the end, it was enough. The final day of the fundraiser arrived with a weight that pressed heavily on Amara's chest. She had poured everything she had into this effort, and yet, as she looked at the small crowd gathered in the town square, doubt still lingered in her heart. The final stretch was here, and every second felt like it carried the weight of her entire journey. She stood on the makeshift stage, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the microphone. The crowd had gathered to hear her speak, and she could feel their collective gaze on her. It was now or never. Amara took a deep breath, her heart racing. I've always dreamed of having a dog, but more than that, I've dreamed of making a difference, of proving that no matter where you come from, no matter how hard things are, you can still change your world. She began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. She paused, looking out at the people she had worked alongside, the people who had doubted her and those who had supported her. I grew up in a town where people judge you based on your skin, your family, how much money you have. But that's not what defines you. What defines you is what you do when the world tells you no. It's the kindness you offer when no one's watching. It's the persistence you have when everything seems impossible. The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft golden glow on the square. Amara could feel the weight of the moment, knowing this was the last chance to convince everyone, including herself, that her dream was worth fighting for. I know I'm just a girl from a poor family. I know my mom can't afford the things I dream of, but I believe that love, that hope, that community, those things are priceless. And if we all come together, if we support each other, we can do anything. She was nearly shaking with emotion now. She wasn't just speaking to the crowd. She was speaking to every person who had ever made her feel small, every person who had doubted that someone like her could make a difference. I'm not asking for pity. I'm asking for kindness. I'm asking for us to come together, to prove that we can be better, that we can make a world where dreams aren't determined by how much money you have. The speech hung in the air like a spark that could ignite something in the hearts of the listeners. There was a long pause as the crowd processed her words. And then, slowly, people began to step forward. Mrs. Green, the elderly woman who had always believed in Amara, approached the stage, holding out a check. A few other townsfolk followed, some with small donations, others with heartfelt words of encouragement. But it wasn't just the familiar faces. The people who had once turned their backs on her, the ones who had doubted and criticized her efforts, now started to soften. Even those who had been indifferent began to feel the pull of her determination. A couple of business owners who had never bothered to help Amara before quietly handed over their contributions, their eyes filled with silent respect. Amara's eyes widened in surprise as one figure emerged from the crowd. Mrs. Thatcher, the woman who had always made Amara feel inferior, walked forward, her face tight with something close to hesitation. Elliot, standing at her side, looked at her with a knowing gaze. Amara's heart skipped a beat. "Amara," Mrs. Thatcher said, her voice flat, but not without some measure of vulnerability. I don't always understand these things. But my son, he told me that you've done something I could never do. Stand up for what you believe in. And I suppose I can't argue with that." Amara's breath caught as Mrs. Thatcher handed over a check, the largest donation Amara had received all day. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a gesture, an acknowledgement that things were changing, a quiet message that perhaps even the most entrenched prejudices could shift if given enough time and perseverance. Elliot looked at Amara, a slight smile playing on his lips. He had been the one to push his mother to donate. He had been the one to stand up to her, to challenge her worldview. And now, He was offering his silent support to Amara's cause in a way she hadn't expected. As the crowd continued to grow, Amara felt the emotions rise in her chest, a whirlwind of joy, exhaustion, and disbelief. She had done it. She had brought the town together. But there was still one hurdle left. The total amount raised was enough to cover Lucky's adoption fee and medical expenses, just barely. Amara's heart raced as she realized there was still one person who held the final key to making this dream a reality. She turned toward the back of the crowd, where Mr. Winston was standing. He had been watching the whole event with a stoic expression, his arms crossed as he observed the unfolding scene. Amara's stomach fluttered nervously. She knew the final approval had to come from him. He was the one who would decide whether Lucky could finally be hers. The crowd grew quiet as Amara made her way to Mr. Winston, her footsteps quick and uncertain. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her shoulders, the sense that everything had come down to this one final question. She met Mr. Winston's gaze, her heart pounding. "Mr. Winston, I've raised enough. I've done everything I can. Please, can you let me adopt Lucky?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow breath, his gaze softening as he looked at her. Amara waited, each second stretching into an eternity. Then, just as the tension reached its peak, Mr. Winston gave a single, decisive nod. "You've done well, Amara. I'll let you take him home." The crowd erupted into cheers, and Amara felt the weight in her chest lift as she realized the impossible had been achieved. She had saved Lucky. But as the cheers echoed around her, another thought entered her mind. This was only the beginning. The challenges, the obstacles, the judgments, they would never fully disappear. But Amara now knew that with love, resilience, and kindness, she could face anything that came her way. And as Lucky bounded into her arms, Amara knew her story had only just begun. Amara stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, her hands trembling with excitement. The moment she had fought for, the moment that had seemed impossible just weeks ago, had arrived. Mr. Winston had given his approval. And now, as he looked at her with a glint of something soft in his eyes, he spoke the words that Amara had dreamed of hearing. "You've earned it, Amara," Mr. Winston said, his voice gruff but warm. "I've waived part of the adoption fee. Lucky's yours." Her breath caught in her throat. Amara could hardly believe it. The weight of the past weeks, the struggles, the doubts, the endless hours spent fighting for something she believed in, all of it had led to this moment. She had fought for Lucky, and now, the scrappy mutt she had fallen in love with was finally going to be hers. Tears welled up in Amara's eyes as she looked at the small, scruffy dog. Lucky, who had been through so much, who had been caught in the same cycle of uncertainty as she had, was finally going to be a part of her family. She couldn't help it. A sob escaped her lips, raw and real, as the full weight of the moment hit her. Lucky looked up at her with his big, trusting eyes, and before she could even kneel down to scoop him up, the dog bounded toward her, tail wagging furiously. He leaped into her arms with such enthusiasm that Amara nearly fell backward, but she caught him, laughing through her tears. The crowd around them erupted in applause, the town square filled with a collective cheer that sent a wave of emotion through Amara's heart. In that moment, nothing else mattered. The struggles she had faced, the prejudice, the doubts, they all melted away as she held Lucky close. The bond between them, formed through perseverance and love, was unbreakable. The little dog, once abandoned and unwanted, now had a place in her heart, just as she had always dreamed. The townspeople gathered around, some clapping, some wiping away tears of their own, as Amara looked around at the faces that had once doubted her. People like Mrs. Thatcher, who had never believed in someone like Amara, were now witnessing the power of resilience and kindness. It was a moment of redemption, not just for Amara, but for the entire town. Mrs. Thatcher, standing at the edge of the crowd with her arms crossed, looked at Amara with something that could almost be called admiration. She didn't say anything, but for the first time, Amara could see that the woman was no longer looking at her with judgment, but with something that resembled respect. Elliot, standing beside his mother, watched the scene with a proud smile. He hadn't just helped Amara. He had helped his own family see the value of kindness, of seeing people for who they truly were, not the label society placed on them. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Amara turned her attention back to Lucky, who was now wriggling in her arms, his little paws scratching at her face. She laughed and kissed his head, feeling the warmth of his fur against her cheek. "We did it, Lucky," she whispered. "We made it." The applause grew louder as the townspeople gathered around to congratulate Amara. Mrs. Green, who had always believed in her, gave her a warm hug. "I knew you could do it, child," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. As the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the town square, Amara stood there with Lucky in her arms, the weight of the world now lifted from her shoulders. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, she knew that. There would always be challenges, always obstacles to overcome. But now, she had something that would carry her through. The knowledge that if you fight for what you believe in, if you show kindness and determination, even the hardest battles can be won. The town had changed that day. The walls of prejudice had cracked, and though they hadn't fully come down, they were no longer impenetrable. The people who had once looked at Amara with disdain now saw her strength, her heart, her worth. It was a new beginning, not just for Amara and Lucky, but for the entire town. Amara looked down at Lucky, who was nuzzling her neck, and smiled through her tears. This was what it was all for. This moment, this bond. It was the reward for everything she had fought for. And as the town celebrated, Amara knew this was just the beginning. There would be more struggles ahead, more moments where she would have to stand tall and prove her worth. But with Lucky by her side, and with the support of the town, and even the unexpected allies who had shown up along the way, Amara knew she could face whatever came next. She was no longer just a poor black girl with a dream. She was a young woman who had fought for that dream, and she had won. In that moment, Amara knew one thing for certain. Kindness, perseverance, and love were more powerful than anything the world could throw at her. And with Lucky by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next. Amara sat on the porch steps. Lucky nestled beside her, his head resting on her lap as she stroked his fur. The warmth of the sun, now low in the sky, bathed the small town in a soft glow, making everything feel peaceful, almost surreal. It was hard to believe how much had changed in such a short time. Just a few weeks ago, she had been a young girl with a dream that seemed impossible, a dream that had been met with skepticism, judgment, and even outright hostility. Now, that dream was reality. Lucky was hers, and the community around her had shifted, too. As she looked around, she could see the changes taking root. The town, once divided by prejudice and economic disparity, had begun to heal. The small acts of kindness, the small gestures of support that had sprung up in the wake of her journey, were creating a ripple effect. Mrs. Thatcher, who had once looked down on Amara and her family, now found herself more open to connecting with people from all walks of life. She didn't speak much about it, but her actions had begun to reflect a new understanding. Amara's heart swelled as she thought back on everything that had led to this moment. Her fundraiser, her tireless efforts, the moments of doubt, they had all come together in a way that not only changed her life but started to change the entire town. She had learned something invaluable through it all. The lesson wasn't just about achieving a dream or overcoming obstacles. It was about the power of kindness, compassion, and resilience in the face of adversity. She thought about the quiet generosity of Mrs. Green, the old woman who had always believed in her, and how her support had never wavered. She thought about Janelle, who had stood by her side, helping her with the fundraiser and offering words of encouragement when Amara had felt like giving up. And then there was Elliot, Mrs. Thatcher's son, who had risked his own reputation to support her. Someone who, like Amara, had struggled with family expectations and societal pressures. Amara realized that her success wasn't just about the money she had raised for Lucky's adoption fee, or even about getting Lucky into her arms. It was about something deeper, something more profound. It was about the idea that small acts of compassion, the willingness to help one another, could start a chain reaction of change. It was about resilience, not just her own, but the resilience of the community. Every person who had supported her, every hand that had reached out, had contributed to the transformation that had taken place. She looked down at Lucky, his eyes meeting hers with unspoken understanding. He had been through so much, just like her. And yet here they both were, standing strong in the face of it all. Lucky wasn't just a dog to her. He was a symbol of perseverance, of the bond between two beings who had refused to give up on each other. Amara turned her gaze toward the town square, where the once divided community was now coming together in new ways. She had seen more smiles, more handshakes, more people reaching out to one another. The differences that had once seemed so vast were now being bridged, slowly but surely, by the shared experiences of everyday life. People who had once kept to themselves were now working together, helping one another in ways that felt genuine and heartfelt. She thought about the speech she had given that day in the square, the words that had come from deep within her heart. Kindness isn't always easy, she had said, but it's always worth it. We can't change the world all at once. But if we each do our part, if we just take a moment to be kind to someone else, we can start a ripple that grows into something beautiful. Those words had resonated with more people than she had expected. They weren't just words. They were a call to action, a reminder that every small act of kindness mattered. Now, as she sat on the porch with Lucky, watching the world around her shift, she realized that the change she had sought had already begun. It wasn't about tearing down walls or dismantling the entire system in one fell swoop. It was about changing hearts, one person at a time. It was about proving that, despite everything stacked against her, Amara had stood tall and made a difference. And in doing so, she had inspired others to do the same. The town's transformation wasn't complete, but it had started, and Amara knew that it was just the beginning. People were talking more, helping more, and seeing one another with new eyes. It wasn't perfect, and there would still be challenges ahead, but she believed in the power of what they had begun. The changes were small, but they were meaningful. They were the kind of changes that could last, the kind that came from the heart. With a deep sigh, Amara leaned back against the porch, the evening breeze brushing through her hair. Lucky stretched out beside her, content and happy, as the world seemed to slow down for just a moment. It was a peaceful feeling, the kind of peace that comes when you know you've done something right, when you know that your actions, no matter how small, have made a difference. Amara had learned that kindness wasn't just about big gestures. It was about the small things, the quiet support, the simple act of helping someone in need, the willingness to stand up for what's right. It was about believing in yourself, even when the world around you seems to tell you that you're not enough. She had done that, and in doing so, she had shown others how to do the same. As the sun set behind the hills, casting a warm golden light over the town, Amara smiled. There was still work to be done, but for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful. The journey had been hard, but the lessons she had learned would stay with her forever. And as long as she had Lucky by her side, she knew she could face whatever came next. After all, if she could overcome everything she had faced, there was no telling what else she could accomplish. The town was changing. Amara had shown them that, and in her heart, she knew that this was just the beginning. Amara and Lucky walked through the park, their footsteps soft against the well-worn path, the setting sun casting a warm glow over the landscape. The park, once a place where Amara had only dreamed of sharing with a dog, had become a symbol of everything she had worked for. Every corner of the park, every tree, every flower seemed to reflect the growth that had happened not just in the town, but within her own heart. Miss Clarice walked beside her, a proud smile on her face, though her tired eyes reflected the weariness of years spent working tirelessly to make ends meet. It had been a long road for them both, but here they were together with Lucky by their side. The love and determination they had shown each other had brought them to this moment, a moment where Amara's dreams were no longer just dreams, but a shared reality. They had come a long way since the days when Miss Clarice had urged Amara to let go of the idea of a puppy. Now, Amara could see the difference in her mother's eyes. There was pride there, but also a deep sense of relief. For the first time in a long while, there was no doubt about Amara's strength, about the path she had carved out for herself. And that was enough. As they walked, Amara's thoughts drifted back to everything that had led her here. The fundraiser, the hours spent earning every penny, the kindness from unexpected people, and the strength it had taken to overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable. She remembered how close she had come to losing hope, how easy it would have been to just give up and accept that some things were out of her control. But the community had rallied around her. Her own resolve had kept her moving forward, and now she stood tall, beside her dog, with her mother at her side. The story of Amara and Lucky had begun to spread far beyond the small town. People from neighboring areas had heard about the girl who refused to give up, who fought for what she believed in, and the dog who had found a new life thanks to her unwavering determination. Their story had inspired others to take action in their own communities, to recognize the power of kindness and resilience, and to understand that change, no matter how small, could make a difference. As they passed the playground, Amara noticed a group of children gathered around, playing and laughing. She had been one of them once, dreaming of a better life, of a future where she was no longer just another face in the crowd. But now, she was someone different. She wasn't just Amara, the girl with the big dreams and small means. She was Amara, the girl who had made those dreams a reality. And that reality had given her more than she had ever imagined. Amara squeezed Lucky's leash a little tighter, feeling his warm body beside her. He had been there for her through it all. He had taught her lessons in patience, loyalty, and love. His playful nature and sweet eyes had given her a reason to keep going even when the world seemed bleak. And now, they walked together, a team, a symbol of what could happen when you never gave up on love, on dreams, on hope. "Mom," Amara said, her voice soft but full of conviction, "I think everything's going to be okay." Miss Clarice looked at her daughter, her expression softening. "You've always had the strength to make things right, Amara," she replied, her voice full of pride. "I just didn't know how much you had to give, but you've shown me. You've shown all of us." They continued walking, the light of the evening sky wrapping around them like a blanket. It was a quiet moment, one that felt almost sacred. There were no grand speeches, no applause from the crowd, but in that silence and the soft sounds of the world around them, Amara knew she had done something significant. Her journey had been difficult, but it had been worth every step. And with Lucky by her side, there was no challenge she couldn't face. She had learned that kindness was more than just an act. It was a way of life. It was the foundation on which dreams were built. It was a force that could heal wounds, bridge divides, and transform not just one life, but many. As they reached the park bench, Amara sat down, Lucky curling up next to her, his head resting on her knee. Miss Clarice sat beside her, and together, they watched the sun dip below the horizon, the last rays casting a golden glow over the world. It was a moment of peace, a peace that had come through struggle, through heartache, but also through triumph. Amara gazed out into the distance, a quiet smile on her face. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing. She had the strength to face whatever came her way. And with her mother by her side and Lucky in her arms, there was nothing she couldn't overcome. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Amara whispered softly, "I'm ready for whatever comes next." And with that, they sat in the quiet of the evening, content, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together,